Gemma Vance had baked at the Golden Glaze for 6 years, and she had never once been late. That morning, she stood behind the display counter arranging almond croissants into a neat golden row when her manager, Bella, called her into the back office. Gemma wiped flour from her hands, smiled, and walked in without a hint of worry. She had just finished a batch of cinnamon rolls that came out perfect, the kind of perfect that took years to master. "We're letting you go," Bella said, not looking up from her clipboard. Gemma blinked. "What?" "It's the rebrand," Bella continued, finally meeting her eyes. "We're going minimalist, sleek. The new investors want the bakery to feel elevated. And honestly, Gemma, you don't fit the image we're going for anymore." The words landed like a slap. Gemma glanced down at her apron, still dusted with sugar, and understood exactly what image meant. It meant her. It meant every curve of her body that had nothing to do with how well she could bake. "I've been here longer than half the staff," Gemma said quietly. "I know. I'm sorry." Bella didn't sound sorry at all. Gemma walked back to her station like she was floating outside her own body. She began packing her things into a cardboard box: her rolling pin, her grandmother's recipe cards, a chipped mug that said "World's Okayest Baker" that her co-workers had gifted her as a joke 3 Christmases ago. Her hands trembled as she folded her apron and set it on the counter for the last time. She didn't cry until she reached the corner booth to collect the tray she'd left there earlier, a small plate holding the last slice of her honey lavender tart. That was when the tears finally came, quiet and hot, sliding down her cheeks as she reached for the plate. "Leave it." The voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise of the bakery like a blade through silk. Gemma froze and looked up. The man in the booth had been there for nearly an hour, though she hadn't paid him much attention until now. He filled the space differently than anyone she'd ever seen sit in that corner. Dark hair closely cropped at the sides, a black wool coat that looked like it cost more than her monthly rent. His jaw was sharp, his eyes a pale, unsettling gray, fixed on the plate in front of him rather than on her. He hadn't touched his coffee once. He reached out, almost hesitantly, and broke off a piece of the tart with his fingers. He ate it. Gemma watched, too stunned by her own mourning to process what she was seeing. She didn't know that the man sitting 3 feet away from her hadn't finished a full meal in nearly 2 years. She didn't know that food had become something he simply endured, tasteless and mechanical, ever since the night his family was torn apart. She didn't know his name was Matteo Vance, or that men twice his size lowered their eyes when he walked into a room, or that an entire criminal empire moved according to the silence he kept. All she knew was that a stranger had just eaten the last thing she would ever bake in this kitchen, and for reasons she couldn't explain, he looked almost stunned by it. He set down the fork. His eyes lifted to hers for the first time. There was something in that gaze that didn't match the rest of him. Not hunger, not appetite. Something closer to disbelief, like a man remembering a color he'd forgotten existed. He didn't say a word. He reached into his coat and placed a card on the table between them. It was heavy, cream-colored, edged in gold foil, with nothing on it but a phone number. Then he stood, buttoned his coat, and walked out of the bakery without so much as a glance back, leaving a $100 bill tucked beneath his untouched coffee cup. Gemma stared at the card long after the door chimed shut behind him. She should have thrown it away. She should have gone home, cried into a pillow, and started applying to every bakery in Boston by morning like a reasonable person. Instead, she picked it up. 3 miles away, in the back seat of a black sedan idling outside the bakery, Matteo pulled out his phone and typed a single message to Marcus, the man who had run his household and his affairs since Matteo was 22 years old and burying both of his parents in the same week. "Find the girl who worked the counter, bakery on Newbury. Bring her and her kitchen tools to the estate. Today." Marcus read the message twice before responding. In 2 years, Matteo Vance had never once asked for a person to be brought to the estate. Bodyguards, yes. Lawyers, accountants, men who needed to disappear quietly. Those requests came often enough that Marcus had stopped questioning them. but never a baker. Understood, sir, Marcus wrote back, already reaching for his coat. May I ask why? The response came a full minute later. She made me taste something again. Marcus stared at the screen for a long moment, unsure if he'd misread it. In the 2 years since the fire that took Matteo's parents and very nearly took his voice along with his will to live, Marcus had watched his employer turn into something closer to a ghost than a man, present in body, but absent in every way that mattered. Food came and went from his plate untouched. Words came and went from his mouth, rarer each month, until whole weeks passed with nothing but nods and written notes. Marcus didn't know who this baker was. He didn't know what she'd done, or why a piece of tart had cracked something open in a man who hadn't reacted to anything in 2 years. But he knew an order when he received one, and he knew better than anyone that whatever this woman had just started, there was no undoing it now. The car that pulled up outside Gemma's apartment that evening was longer than her entire living room. She'd spent the afternoon staring at the gold-edged card, turning it over in her hands, half convinced it was some elaborate prank. But when she finally called the number, a calm, measured voice answered on the second ring and introduced himself as Marcus. He didn't explain much. He simply asked if she'd be willing to consider a private position as a personal chef, told her the pay would be more than generous, and said a car would collect her within the hour if she agreed. She should have said no. Every instinct told her to say no. Instead, she packed a bag with her knives, her rolling pin, and the box of things she'd carried out of the bakery that morning. And she said yes. Now, sitting in the back of the sedan as it wound along the Rhode Island coastline, Gemma watched the ocean flash between rows of hedges and stone walls until the car finally slowed before a set of iron gates taller than any fence she'd ever seen. They opened without a sound. The estate beyond them looked less like a house and more like something lifted out of a postcard. Gray stone, ivy climbing one wing, windows glowing warm and yellow against the deepening blue of the evening sky. A man was waiting on the front steps as the car pulled in. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a simple dark suit that gave away nothing about who he worked for. He opened her door himself. "Miss Vance," he said, "I'm Marcus. Thank you for coming." "I'm still not entirely sure why I did," Gemma admitted, stepping out and immediately feeling underdressed beside the grandeur of the house. Marcus allowed himself a small, tired smile. "That makes 2 of us, if I'm honest." He led her through the entrance hall, past a curved staircase and a hallway lined with paintings she didn't have time to study, and into a kitchen that made her stop walking entirely. It was enormous. Gleaming steel counters, a 6-burner range, an entire wall of shelving stocked with ingredients she recognized from restaurants she'd only ever read about in magazines. A walk-in pantry stood open at the far end, already organized with more precision than her old kitchen had managed in 6 years. "This will be yours," Marcus said. "Fully yours. Order whatever you need. Change whatever you like. Mr. Vance won't interfere." "Mr. Vance," Gemma repeated. "That's the man from the bakery." "Matteo Vance, yes." Marcus's expression shifted, just slightly, into something more careful. "Before you meet him properly, there are a few things you should understand." Gemma set her bag down on the counter and waited. 2 years ago there was a fire, Marcus said. It finished both of his parents. Matteo was in the house when it happened. He got out. They didn't. He paused, choosing his next words with visible care. Since then, he hasn't spoken more than a handful of sentences to anyone, myself included, and he hasn't eaten a full meal that I know of, not one. He picks at things, he drinks black coffee. That's it. "That's not possible," Gemma said quietly. "A person can't survive 2 years like that." "He survives," Marcus said. "He doesn't live. There's a difference." Gemma thought of the man in the corner booth, the way he'd reached for her tart, almost without meaning to, the stunned look on his face when he tasted it. "This morning, at the bakery, he ate." "I know," Marcus said. That's why you're here." The weight of that landed heavier than Gemma expected. She wasn't being hired to cook. She was being hired to fix something, or at least to try, and nobody had bothered to ask if she wanted that kind of responsibility. "I should tell you," Marcus added, lowering his voice, "that Mr. Vance runs businesses that operate outside conventional channels. I won't insult you by pretending otherwise, and I won't lie to you about the danger that can sometimes come with this house. But you will be protected here. Nothing will happen to you under this roof." Gemma's stomach tightened, but oddly, she didn't feel the urge to run. Maybe it was exhaustion from the day. Maybe it was the memory of Bella's flat, dismissive voice telling her she didn't fit the image anymore. Whatever it was, she found herself nodding instead of backing toward the door. "All right," she said. "Where do I start?" Marcus looked almost relieved. "Dinner. Tonight. Nothing elaborate. He won't eat elaborate. Something simple. Something honest." Gemma thought for a moment, then reached for her apron, tying it around her waist with the same steady motion she'd used 1,000 times before. Roast chicken, she decided. Rosemary potatoes. A recipe her grandmother had taught her before Gemma even knew what a bakery was. If 2 years of grief had stripped this man down to someone who couldn't stomach food anymore, she wasn't going to hit him with anything fancy. She was going to feed him like family. An hour later, the scent of rosemary and roasted garlic drifted through the halls of the estate. Gemma carried the tray herself into a dining room so large her old apartment could have fit inside it twice over, with a long table set for exactly one place. Matteo was already seated at the head of it when she entered. He looked different than he had that morning. No coat now, just a plain gray sweater that somehow made him seem younger, more tired, more human. He watched her approach without a word, his gray eyes tracking the tray in her hands rather than her face. When she reached the table, he stood. Gemma froze, unsure what was happening, until she realized he was pulling out the second chair. Not for himself. For her. She hesitated only a moment before sitting. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He simply returned to his own seat, waited until she'd set the plate in front of him, and picked up his fork. Nobody said anything for a long time, but he ate. By the third night, Gemma had stopped expecting him to speak. Dinner had become a strange, quiet ritual. She cooked, she carried the tray in herself, and Matteo ate in silence while she sat across from him, pretending not to watch too closely. He never finished everything on his plate. He'd get through half, sometimes 2/3, and then simply stop, setting his fork down with the same careful precision he seemed to bring to everything. Gemma told herself it was progress. A man who hadn't eaten properly in 2 years wasn't going to be fixed by one roast chicken. Still, something about the silence gnawed at her. Not the quiet itself, she didn't mind quiet, but the sense that he was holding his breath through his own life, waiting for something without knowing what it was. She couldn't sleep that night. The guest room they'd given her was beautiful, all soft linens and a view of the water, but her mind kept circling back to the house, to the man in it, to the strange weight of being handed a stranger's grief and asked to cook her way through it. Around midnight, she gave up on sleep entirely and padded down to the kitchen in her socks. Baking had always been the thing that settled her. Back in Boston, on nights when the world felt too loud, she'd stay after closing and make something just for herself. No orders to fill, no customers to please. She found the same comfort here, in a kitchen too large and too quiet, pulling out flour and butter and a sack of apples she'd spotted in the pantry earlier that day. She made the pie the way her grandmother had taught her, from a house in Vermont that smelled permanently of cinnamon. A vanilla bean crust, rolled thin and folded 3 times for flakiness. Apples tossed with brown sugar, a little lemon, a pinch of nutmeg that most recipes left out, but that made all the difference. She worked slowly, humming under her breath, losing track of time the way she always did when her hands were busy and her mind was finally quiet. She didn't hear him come in. "That smells like something," a voice said. Not spoken aloud, but she felt him before she heard anything at all. A presence at the edge of the kitchen island, half in shadow. She turned and found Mateo standing there in a plain white shirt, sleeves pushed up, hair slightly mussed like he'd been lying awake, same as her. "You couldn't sleep either," she said. It wasn't a question. He didn't answer, but he didn't leave either. He crossed the kitchen and sat on one of the stools at the island, watching her hands work the dough with an attention that made her fingers fumble slightly under the weight of it. "It's apple pie," she offered, filling the silence the way she'd gotten used to doing over dinner. "My grandmother used to say a good pie takes patience, not talent. You can teach patience. Talent's harder." Something flickered across his face. Not quite a smile, but close enough that Gemma's chest tightened with the effort of not staring at it. She slid the pie into the oven and busied herself cleaning the counter, stealing glances at him every so often. He didn't move to leave. He sat there in the dim kitchen light, elbows on the island, watching her the way a man watches a fire he's forgotten how to feel the warmth of. 40 minutes later, the smell of caramelized apples and warm butter filled the entire kitchen. Gemma pulled the pie out, golden and bubbling at the edges, and let it rest just long enough to keep the slices from falling apart. She cut a piece, set it on a plate, and slid it across the island to him without a word, mirroring the silence he so often kept. He looked at the plate for a long moment before picking up the fork. Gemma held her breath without meaning to. The first bite was small, careful, the way a person tests water before deciding whether it's too hot or too cold. He chewed slowly. His eyes closed, just for a second, and something in his shoulders loosened in a way she hadn't seen since she'd arrived. He took a second bite, then a third. Gemma busied herself wiping down a countertop that didn't need wiping, giving him space to eat without the pressure of being watched, though she couldn't stop herself from glancing over every few seconds. Plate by plate, bite by bite, he ate the entire slice. Every crumb. When he finally set the fork down, the plate was empty for the first time since she'd arrived at this house. Neither of them said anything. The kitchen clock ticked somewhere behind her, and the ocean murmured faintly through the cracked window. And for a long moment, it felt like the whole world had gone still around the two of them. Then Mateo looked up. He didn't smile fully. She didn't think he was capable of that yet, but the corner of his mouth lifted, just barely, and he gave her a single, slow nod. It wasn't much. It was the smallest gesture a person could make. But Gemma felt it land somewhere deep in her chest, warmer than anything Bella's rejection had managed to burn away that morning back in Boston. He rose from the stool, pushed it back in with quiet care, and walked toward the doorway. Just before he disappeared into the hall, he paused, glancing back at her one last time. Whatever he was thinking, he kept it to himself, the way he kept everything to himself. But his eyes lingered a second longer than they needed to. Then he was gone, swallowed by the dark hallway, leaving Gemma alone in the kitchen with an empty plate and a strange, fluttering feeling she didn't have a name for yet. She stood there for a long time after he left, staring at the doorway, before she finally allowed herself to smile. Something had shifted tonight. She didn't know what it meant yet, or where it would lead, but for the first time since stepping through those iron gates, Gemma Vance felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The trouble started with a smell. Gemma noticed it the moment she walked into the kitchen the following afternoon. Something faintly sour under the usual scent of fresh bread and coffee. She traced it to the walk-in refrigerator, and when she pulled the door open, her stomach dropped. The temperature gauge read 52 degrees. It should have read 38. Everything inside had turned. The cream had separated. The fish Marcus had specially ordered for that evening's dinner sat grey and glistening in a way that made her recoil. 2 full trays of vegetables, prepped and washed the night before, had gone limp and slick with spoilage. Someone had turned the dial, and from the state of things, they'd done it hours ago. Likely sometime before dawn, when the house was still asleep, and no one would notice until it was far too late to fix quietly. No, 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 Gemma muttered, yanking out tray after tray, hoping against hope that something had survived. Nothing had. She knew, without needing proof, that this wasn't an accident. A commercial fridge like this didn't drift 14 degrees on its own. The dinner tonight wasn't an ordinary meal. Marcus had told her that morning, with more tension in his voice than she'd heard from him before, that 2 of Mateo's business associates were coming to discuss a deal that had been months in the making. Everything needed to be flawless. And now, 3 hours before service, she had nothing but spoiled fish and wilted greens to work with. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Renaud, the estate's former head chef, leaning against the doorway with his arms crossed. He'd been quietly cold to her since the night she'd made the pie. She'd caught him watching from the hallway once, jaw tight, saying nothing. Renaud had run this kitchen for 3 years before she arrived, and it was clear from the first day that he resented having his territory handed to a stranger from a strip mall bakery. "Rough morning?" he asked, his tone carrying no real concern at all. Gemma studied his face for a long moment, searching for any flicker of guilt. He gave her nothing, his expression as smooth and unreadable as polished stone. She didn't have proof. She didn't have time to look for it either. "I need you to help me figure out what we can pull together," she said instead, swallowing her suspicion for the moment. Pride wasn't going to save this dinner. Renaud's mouth curved, thin and unhelpful. "Not really my job anymore, is it?" He turned and walked away, leaving her alone with a ruined refrigerator and a clock that wouldn't stop moving. For one panicked second, Gemma allowed herself to feel the full weight of it, the urge to sit down on the tile floor and cry the way she had in the bakery 2 days ago. Then she straightened her spine, wiped her hands on her apron, and did what she'd always done best. She improvised. She raided the pantry with the focus of someone defusing a bomb, pulling down dried mushrooms, a wheel of aged cheese, jars of preserved tomatoes, a bag of good flour, and a bottle of white wine that had been sitting untouched on a high shelf. No fresh fish, no delicate vegetables, but she had enough to build something honest. A rustic mushroom risotto, finished with the cheese and a splash of wine. Fresh bread, since dough didn't need refrigeration and she could have a batch proofed and baked within the hour. A simple tomato tart with the preserved tomatoes, roasted until they caramelized into something rich enough to fool anyone into thinking it had been planned all along. She worked without stopping, flour on her cheeks, sweat at her hairline, moving through the kitchen like she'd been born in it. And in a strange way, she had been. 6 years behind a bakery counter had taught her how to make something beautiful out of very little. And very little was exactly what she had left. She didn't notice Mateo standing in the doorway until she turned around with a tray in her hands. He'd clearly heard. His jaw was set, his grey eyes darker than she'd seen them, moving slowly around the kitchen, taking in the empty refrigerator, the frantic state of the counters, the tension still lingering in the air from Renaud's visit. "It's handled," Gemma said quickly, before he could think she needed rescuing. "We're not serving what I planned, but it'll be good. I promise." He said nothing, but he didn't leave either. He crossed the kitchen, rolled up his sleeves without a word, and picked up a knife from the block. "You don't have to," Gemma started. He was already chopping, his movements steady and precise, lining up a row of shallots with the same quiet efficiency he seemed to carry into everything. Whatever he lacked in words, he made up for in presence, standing beside her at the counter, working in a silence that no longer felt heavy the way it once had. They worked together like that for nearly an hour, side by side, the kitchen filling with the smell of toasted bread and simmering wine. Gemma found herself sneaking glances at him between tasks, the sleeves pushed up over strong forearms, the focus in his eyes. The way he seemed almost lighter with a knife in his hand than he ever did sitting at the head of that long, empty table. Later that evening, as the guests arrived and the risotto came out steaming and golden, Marcus pulled Gemma aside just long enough to slide a folded slip of paper into her hand. She opened it once the door had closed behind him. "Renaud is no longer employed here. He will not return to the estate. M.V. She looked up, searching the dining room until she found Matteo seated at the head of the table, his gaze already on her from across the room. He held her eyes for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them that felt heavier than any written note could carry. Then, almost imperceptibly, he inclined his head toward her chair. Gemma folded the slip of paper, tucked it into her apron pocket, and walked into the dining room to serve the meal she'd built out of nothing but instinct and stubbornness. Whatever had shifted between them in that kitchen tonight, she had the distinct feeling it wasn't going away anytime soon. The convoy left Newport before sunrise. Gemma hadn't been told much, only that Marcus had come to her room the night before, told her to pack for a week in colder weather, and that Mr. Vance had decided to relocate his inner circle to the mountains while certain matters in the city settled. She didn't ask what matters. She'd learned by now that the less she knew about the business side of this house, the more peacefully she slept. 3 hours later, the ocean had disappeared behind them entirely, replaced by rolling hills and then, gradually, mountains, their peaks just beginning to catch the first gold and rust of autumn. The cabin, when they finally arrived, wasn't what Gemma had pictured. She'd expected something rustic, small, a weekend getaway. Instead, it was a sprawling timber lodge tucked into the tree line, all exposed beams and enormous windows, smoke already curling from one of its 3 chimneys by the time their car pulled up the gravel drive. "It's beautiful," she said, more to herself than to anyone. "He built it after his parents passed," Marcus said quietly, coming to stand beside her as she stared up at the lodge. "Said he needed somewhere the walls didn't remember anything." Gemma turned that thought over in her mind for the rest of the afternoon as she settled into the cabin's kitchen, smaller than the one in Newport, but somehow warmer, with a wood-burning stove and windows that looked straight out onto a stand of birch trees just beginning to turn yellow. There was something about the mountain air, thinner and sharper than the coastal breeze she'd grown used to, that seemed to loosen something in the whole household. The guards, who normally stood rigid at the estate's gates, wandered the grounds here with their hands in their pockets. Marcus laughed at something one of the drivers said, an actual laugh, the first she'd heard from him. Even Matteo seemed different. She caught him the second morning standing on the back porch in a heavy flannel jacket, watching the mist roll off the tree line with his hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee. He wasn't holding himself the way he did in Newport, shoulders squared like a man perpetually bracing for bad news. Here, he simply stood, still and quiet, but not tense. Watching him like that, Gemma felt something warm settle low in her chest. Something she hadn't quite let herself name. That afternoon, with dinner prepped and simmering slowly on the stove, Gemma decided to explore the trail behind the cabin, drawn by the smell of pine and the crunch of fallen leaves under her boots. She hadn't gone far when she heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Matteo following at a distance, hands in his pockets, saying nothing, but clearly intending to join her. "You don't have to babysit me," she said, half teasing. "I promise I can survive a walk in the woods." He didn't answer, but he fell into step beside her anyway, and she found she didn't mind the company nearly as much as she pretended to. They walked for almost 20 minutes without speaking, the silence between them easier now than it had been that first week at the estate. Gemma had grown almost fluent in his quiet, learning to read the small shifts in his expression, the way his eyes lingered a beat longer on things that mattered to him. She pointed out a hawk circling above the tree line, and he tilted his head to watch it, something almost boyish in the gesture that made her chest ache in a way she didn't fully understand. The trail narrowed as it curved down toward a small creek, the ground beneath them shifting from packed dirt to loose gravel scattered with wet leaves. Gemma was mid-sentence, telling him about a customer back at the bakery who used to order the same croissant every single morning for 4 years without ever once saying thank you, when her boot caught on a patch of slick stone. Her foot slid out from under her before she even registered what was happening. She let out a sharp gasp, arms flailing for something to grab onto, certain she was about to land hard on the rocky slope beneath her. Instead, an arm caught her around the waist. Matteo had moved faster than she thought a person could move, closing the distance between them in the space of a single heartbeat, his arm locking firmly around her, pulling her upright and steady against him before her balance had even fully failed. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Gemma's hand had come to rest against his chest instinctively, and she could feel his heart beating fast beneath her palm, faster than it should have been for a man who'd simply caught someone from falling. His other hand had found the small of her back, holding her there with a gentleness that felt at odds with the sheer strength she'd just felt in the way he'd caught her. She looked up at him, and he was already looking down at her, close enough now that she could see flecks of a deeper gray in his eyes that she'd never noticed before, close enough to feel the warmth of his breath in the cold mountain air. Neither of them said anything. Words, she was beginning to understand, had never really been the currency between them anyway. His gaze dropped, just briefly, to her mouth, and something in his jaw tightened, a battle playing out behind his eyes that she couldn't quite read. Then, slowly, carefully, as though remembering himself, he straightened her fully onto her feet and let his arms fall away, though he kept one steadying hand at her elbow a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you," Gemma said, breathless, though she wasn't entirely sure if it was from the fall or from what had almost happened after it. He nodded once, his usual quiet returning, but something had shifted in the air between them, something neither silence nor distance could fully undo. They finished the walk back to the cabin slower than before, closer than before, and when Gemma glanced over at him once more before they reached the porch, she caught him already watching her, an unreadable warmth behind those grey eyes that hadn't been there a week ago. Whatever this was becoming, she thought, it had stopped being about pie and quiet dinners a long time ago. The man arrived at the cabin just after 7, driven up the gravel road in a black car that looked wrong against the quiet backdrop of pine trees and wood smoke. Gemma had been warned only an hour earlier that a guest was coming, someone connected to a logistics dispute that Marcus explained in careful, vague terms as she prepped a tray of coffee and small plates for the lounge. He didn't tell her much beyond that, but the tightness in his shoulders and the extra guards suddenly stationed along the porch told her more than words could have. She caught her first glimpse of the visitor through the kitchen doorway as he was shown into the lounge, a tall man in an expensive grey suit, silver rings on both hands, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He introduced himself to Marcus as Dominic, though Gemma got the distinct sense that whatever business he ran, it wasn't the kind that came with a business card. Matteo was already seated at the head of the long wooden table when Dominic entered, dressed simply in black, his expression unreadable in the way it always was during these visits. He didn't stand to greet the man, he didn't offer his hand, he simply gestured toward the seat across from him and waited. Gemma stayed near the kitchen doorway, watching the exchange unfold from a careful distance. Dominic spoke fast and confidently, gesturing with his rings catching the firelight, laying out terms about shipping routes and territory lines that meant nothing to her, but clearly meant a great deal to the tension building in the room. Matteo said almost nothing in return. He let long silences stretch after each of Dominic's points, silences that seemed to unsettle the other man more than any argument could have. It was, Gemma realized, exactly what Marcus had told her about weeks ago. Matteo's silence wasn't emptiness, it was a weapon, sharpened by 2 years of grief into something that made grown men shift uncomfortably in their seats, uncertain whether they'd won an advantage or walked straight into a trap. Around the half-hour mark, Marcus caught her eye and gave a small nod, the signal to bring in the coffee. Gemma carried the tray in herself, setting cups quietly in front of each man, careful not to interrupt the negotiation. She'd nearly finished when Dominic's gaze landed on her, lingering a moment too long. "And who's this?" he asked, a slow smile spreading across his face as he looked her over. "Didn't realize hospitality had improved so much around here." His eyes dropped, taking in the softness of her figure with a look that made her skin crawl, and he added, low enough that he probably thought it was clever, "Big enough to keep a man warm through winter, I'd say." The room went cold in an instant, Gemma froze mid-pour, her fingers tightening around the handle of the coffee pot, humiliation flooding through her chest, hot and fast. The same helpless sting she'd felt standing in Bella's office days ago. She kept her eyes down, focused on finishing the pour, refusing to give the man the satisfaction of a reaction. Before Marcus could so much as shift in his chair, the flat of Matteo's palm hit the table with a crack that made the cups rattle in their saucers. The sound cut through the room like a gunshot. Dominic's smile vanished instantly. Matteo hadn't raised his voice, hadn't said a single word, but he was on his feet now, leaning slightly across the table, his eyes locked on Dominic with an intensity that made even Gemma take an involuntary step back. There was nothing controlled about the look on his face. It was fury, cold and absolute, the kind that didn't need volume to be terrifying. Dominic's hands lifted slightly, palms out, his easy confidence gone entirely. "I meant nothing by it," he said quickly, the words tumbling out faster than before. "It was a joke. Poor taste. I apologize." Matteo didn't sit back down. He held Dominic's gaze for a long, unbearable moment, long enough that the man's forehead had begun to shine faintly with sweat, despite the cool mountain air drifting through the cracked window. Finally, with visible effort, Dominic turned toward Gemma and offered a stiff, hollow apology, the kind clearly extracted rather than felt. Gemma nodded once, her throat too tight to trust with words, and retreated toward the kitchen with the empty tray. It was several minutes before the negotiation resumed, Matteo's silence now carrying a weight that made Dominic choose every remaining word with visible care, rushing through the rest of the terms as though eager to be finished and gone from the house entirely. Gemma stood at the kitchen counter long after the tray was set down, her hands still slightly unsteady, replaying the moment over and over. She had expected, if anything, for the comment to slide by unnoticed, the way so many careless remarks about her body had slid by over the years, brushed off by managers and co-workers who found it easier to stay quiet than to defend her. She had never once expected a room to go silent because someone had spoken to her that way. She had never expected a man like Matteo, who could go days without a single word, to make his fury known so completely without needing one. Later that night, after Dominic's car had disappeared down the gravel drive and the house had settled back into its usual quiet, Gemma found Matteo standing alone on the back porch, staring out at the dark tree line, his jaw still tight with the remnants of whatever he'd been holding back all evening. She came to stand beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "Thank you," she said softly, "for earlier." He turned to look at her, and for the first time, she saw something almost raw in his expression, something that went beyond simple protectiveness. He studied her face for a long moment, as if searching for the right way to say what he couldn't put into words. Then he reached out, gently, and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek a moment longer than necessary before he let his hand fall away. He didn't need to say anything. Gemma understood, standing there in the cold mountain air, that whatever she was to this house, whatever she'd become to the man beside her, she was no longer someone whose worth could be measured by a stranger's careless comment. She was untouchable now, and it was because he had decided she would be. The days after Dominic's visit settled into something gentler. Gemma noticed it in small ways first, the way Matteo lingered a little longer over breakfast, the way he'd taken to sitting near the kitchen window in the evenings while she cooked, instead of disappearing into his study the moment dinner ended. Something had loosened in him since the mountain trail, since the porch, since the crack of his palm against that table. She didn't know exactly what to call it, only that the silence between them had stopped feeling like a wall and started feeling more like a language she was slowly learning to speak. On their 5th night at the cabin, the temperature dropped sharply after sundown, the kind of cold that crept in through the windows despite the fires burning in every hearth. Gemma had finished cleaning the kitchen and was preparing to turn in for the night when she noticed the porch light still on through the back window, a shadow seated on the veranda steps, still as stone against the darkness of the trees beyond. She brewed a pot of chamomile tea without really thinking about why, poured 2 mugs, and carried them out into the cold. Matteo glanced up as the door creaked open, his expression unreadable in the dim porch light, but he shifted slightly to make room for her on the step beside him.
Gemma settled down, handed him one of the mugs, and wrapped both hands around her own for warmth, letting the silence stretch comfortably between them the way it so often did now. Above them, the sky had gone impossibly clear, stars scattered thick and bright in a way she'd never seen back in Boston, where the city lights swallowed everything past the brightest few. She tipped her head back, studying them, and felt Matteo's gaze shift toward her rather than the sky. "I used to think this would be a temporary thing," Gemma said quietly, breaking the silence first. "Cooking for you. I figured I'd stay a few weeks, help however I could, and go back to normal life eventually." She turned the mug slowly between her palms. "I don't think that anymore." He said nothing, but he was watching her closely now, waiting. "The day I got fired," she continued, "my manager told me I didn't fit the image anymore. Sleek and minimalist, she called it, like I was furniture that had gone out of style." She let out a small, humorless laugh. "It wasn't the first time someone made me feel that way. It was just the first time it cost me my job over it." She hadn't meant to say all of that. The words had simply slipped out into the cold night air, easier to speak into the dark beside a man who never judged her with words of his own. "For a long time, I believed them," she admitted. "I thought maybe I really was too much, too soft, too loud, too everything. I got small on purpose sometimes, just to make people comfortable." She glanced over at him. "Being here has done something strange to me. I don't feel like I need to shrink in this house. I don't know when that changed, but it did." Matteo's jaw tightened, something fierce and quiet moving behind his eyes. He set his mug down on the step beside him and reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, pulling out a small leather-bound journal, its cover worn soft at the corners from years of handling. Gemma had seen him carry it before, tucked always close, though she'd never once seen him open it in front of her. He flipped to a blank page, pulled a pen from the same pocket, and began to write, his hand moving slow and deliberate across the paper. Gemma waited, watching the muscles in his jaw work as he chose each word with visible care. When he finished, he turned the journal toward her. "They were blind. Your warmth keeps this house alive. You saved me." Gemma read the words twice, her throat tightening painfully around a knot of emotion she hadn't seen coming. She looked up at him and found him watching her with an intensity that made the cold night air feel suddenly warm. "Matteo," she whispered, his name feeling strange and intimate on her tongue after so many days of silence between them. "I didn't save you. You did that yourself. I just made pie." He shook his head slowly, taking the journal back only long enough to write one more line beneath the first. "I hadn't eaten in 2 years. I hadn't wanted to. Until you." Gemma pressed a hand to her mouth, tears rising unexpectedly, blurring the stars overhead into soft points of light. She thought of Marcus's words that first night at the estate. 2 years without a single full meal. 2 years of grief so heavy it had swallowed a man whole, and understood, fully for the first time, exactly how much weight rested behind the words he'd just written for her. "You've said more to me tonight in that journal," she said quietly, "than I think you've said to anyone in years." Something flickered across his face, close to a smile, though it faded quickly into something more solemn. He reached out, gently tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, the way he had that night on the porch after Dominic's visit, his fingers lingering against her cheek longer this time, tracing the curve of it with a tenderness that made her breath catch. Gemma leaned into his touch without thinking, closing the last small distance between them until her forehead rested lightly against his. Neither of them moved to close the gap further. It wasn't the moment for that yet, not entirely, but it was close enough that she could feel the unsteady rhythm of his breathing against her skin, could feel the same rhythm answered by her own racing heart. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in silence and cold mountain air,
two people who had somehow found each other in the wreckage of their separate griefs, neither one quite ready to name what was growing between them, but both of them, finally, no longer willing to pretend it wasn't there. The city felt different after 2 weeks away. Gemma hadn't realized how much the mountains had changed her until the car pulled back into Boston's financial district, the skyline rising sharp and grey against a cloudy afternoon sky, horns and traffic replacing the quiet she'd grown used to. She sat beside Matteo in the back seat, watching familiar streets pass by, streets she'd walked 1,000 times before everything had changed, and felt strangely like a visitor in a city she used to call home. The merger, Marcus had explained on the drive-in, was the final piece of something Matteo had been building for over a year, a legitimate real estate venture that would fold several of his business interests into something clean, public-facing, respectable. It was, Marcus said quietly, the first real step Matteo had taken since the fire to build something forward-looking instead of simply holding the line on what remained. Tonight's gala would seal it. Investors, city officials, old money and new, all gathered under one roof to celebrate a deal 2 years in the making. "You don't have to come tonight if you'd rather not," Matteo had written to her that morning, sliding the note across the breakfast table with the same careful precision he brought to everything. "It won't be a quiet room." Gemma had smiled and written back a single line beneath his, "I go where you go now." He'd looked at her for a long moment after reading it, something soft moving behind his eyes, before folding the note and tucking it into his jacket pocket instead of discarding it. That evening, Gemma stood in front of the mirror in her hotel suite, smoothing the deep emerald gown Marcus had arranged for her, feeling more like herself in it than she'd expected to. It fit her curves rather than fighting them, the fabric catching the light every time she moved, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she looked at her own reflection without hearing Bella's voice in the back of her mind. The gala was held in a glass-walled ballroom overlooking the harbor, the kind of venue Gemma had only ever seen from the outside, walking past on her way home from closing shifts at the bakery. Matteo arrived beside her in a sharply tailored black suit, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back as they made their way toward the entrance, a silent, steady presence that kept the nerves fluttering in her chest from turning into full panic. They were nearly at the door when a voice called out behind them, sharp and unmistakable. "Gemma? Gemma Vance?" She turned, and her stomach dropped. Bella stood a few feet away in a stiff black dress, clutching a glass of champagne, her expression flickering rapidly from confusion to something closer to smug disbelief as she took in the gown, the venue, the man standing beside her former employee. "I almost didn't recognize you," Bella said, her tone dripping with the same false sweetness Gemma remembered from the day she'd been fired. "What are you doing here? Catering, I'm guessing?" The words landed exactly the way Gemma knew they were meant to. Small, deliberate, designed to remind her of her place. A year ago, even a month ago, she might have shrunk under the weight of it, might have mumbled something apologetic and slipped away toward the nearest exit. Instead, she felt Matteo's hand press more firmly against her back, grounding her, and she found she didn't need to say anything at all. "Actually," Gemma said calmly, "I'm here as Mr. Vance's guest." Bella's smile faltered, her eyes darting toward Matteo for the first time, taking in the suit, the bearing, the quiet authority radiating off him even in stillness. Recognition seemed to dawn slowly, followed by something like alarm, as she clearly began putting together exactly whose company she'd just insulted. I didn't realize," Bella stammered. "I was only teasing, I didn't mean—" Matteo stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply moved half a step in front of Gemma, close enough that his shoulder blocked most of Bella's view of her, and fixed the woman with a look so cold and unblinking that Gemma watched the color visibly drain from Bella's face. Marcus, standing a few feet back, shifted his weight in a way that suggested he was prepared to intervene the moment it became necessary, though it was clear from Bella's rapidly retreating posture that it wouldn't be. I should find my table," Bella said quickly, already backing away, champagne sloshing dangerously close to the rim of her glass. "It was nice seeing you, Gemma, truly." She disappeared into the crowd without waiting for a response, weaving through clusters of guests with a kind of urgency that suggested she had no intention of coming anywhere near their side of the room for the rest of the evening. Gemma let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, something between a laugh and disbelief bubbling up in her chest. "You didn't have to do that." Matteo turned to face her fully, his expression softening the moment his eyes found hers again. He reached up, brushing his knuckles gently along her jaw, a small, private gesture that felt entirely at odds with the ballroom full of watching eyes around them. He didn't write anything down this time. He didn't need to. The look on his face said everything his silence usually carried in written words, that he would stand between her and every small cruelty the world tried to hand her for as long as she'd let him. Gemma leaned into his touch briefly before he offered his arm, guiding her toward the ballroom entrance, past the glittering crowd and the low murmur of conversation, into a room full of people who would spend the evening celebrating a deal that would secure Matteo's place as one of the city's most respected names. But as they crossed the threshold together, Gemma understood that whatever was being sealed tonight, it wasn't just business. Something had shifted permanently between them, and neither of them, not even a man who'd once gone 2 years without a single word, seemed inclined to hide it any longer. The morning after the gala, the estate in Newport felt different than Gemma had ever known it to feel, lighter somehow, as though the walls themselves had exhaled after 2 long years of holding their breath. The merger had gone through without a single hitch. Marcus had told her over breakfast that the paperwork was finalized just before midnight. Matteo's name now attached to something clean and forward-facing for the first time since his parents had died. Gemma hadn't fully understood the weight of what that meant until she saw Matteo himself that morning, standing on the balcony off his study with a mug of coffee in hand, his shoulders loose in a way she'd never quite seen before, watching the ocean like a man finally allowed to rest. "He wants to see you tonight," Marcus told her later that afternoon, appearing in the kitchen doorway with an expression she couldn't quite place. "Private dinner, just the 2 of you. He's asked that you not worry about cooking this time." Gemma raised an eyebrow. "That's new." "A lot has been new lately," Marcus said, and there was something almost fond in the way he said it, before he turned and left her alone with her thoughts. That evening, she dressed simply, choosing a soft blue dress rather than anything formal, and made her way to the private balcony off the east wing, a space she'd only glimpsed once before, tucked away from the rest of the house and rarely used. She found it transformed, a small table set for 2 beneath strings of warm lantern light, the ocean stretching dark and endless beyond the railing, the scent of salt air mixing with something sweet drifting from a covered dish at the center of the table. Matteo was already waiting, dressed in a simple dark sweater, and he rose the moment she stepped onto the balcony, pulling out her chair with the same quiet care he'd shown that very first night, when neither of them had known what the other would come to mean. Dinner passed in comfortable silence, the kind she'd grown so used to that it no longer felt like an absence of something, but rather a fullness all its own. Partway through the meal, he set down his fork and reached for the leather journal he still carried everywhere, flipping to a fresh page. "There's something I never told you," he wrote, sliding it across the table. Gemma's stomach tightened with a flicker of unease as she read the line. "Okay," she said carefully. "I'm listening." He hesitated, pen hovering over the page longer than usual, before continuing to write. "My mother used to bake. Apple pie, mostly. It was the last thing I ever ate in that house, the morning of the fire. I hadn't tasted it again since, not properly, not anywhere. Until that night in the kitchen, when you made yours." Gemma's breath caught, her eyes lifting from the page to find him watching her with an intensity that made the lantern light around them seem to blur at the edges. "Matteo," she whispered. "I didn't know." "I didn't choose that bakery by accident that day," he continued writing, his hand steadier now, as though the hardest part had already been said. "A friend of my mother's mentioned a young baker in Boston, said her pies reminded her of the ones my mother used to make. I went to see for myself. I told myself it was curiosity. It became something else the moment I tasted what you'd made. The revelation settled over Gemma slowly, reshaping everything she thought she'd understood about that first day. The card on the table, the sudden decision to bring her to the estate, the way he'd looked at her, as though she'd handed him something he'd given up hoping to find again. It hadn't been random at all. It had been grief, reaching backward for something it recognized, long before either of them understood what it was reaching toward. "I'm not her," Gemma said softly, once she trusted her voice again. "I never could be." He shook his head firmly, setting the pen down and reaching across the table to take her hand in both of his. "I know that," he wrote quickly, almost urgently, before adding one final line beneath it. "You gave me something new, not a memory, a future." Gemma felt tears rise, warm and unexpected, blurring the string lights overhead into soft halos. She squeezed his hand, unable to find words steady enough to match what he'd just given her. Matteo rose from his chair. He crossed to her side of the table, still holding her hand, and pulled her gently to her feet, close enough now that she could feel the unsteady rhythm of his breathing, the same rhythm she'd felt against her skin that night on the mountain porch weeks ago. He reached into his pocket, and for a moment, Gemma thought he meant to retrieve the journal again. Instead, he withdrew a small velvet box. Her breath caught entirely, her heart hammering as he opened it to reveal a ring, simple and elegant, catching the lantern light in a way that made her vision swim. He didn't reach for the journal this time. His jaw tightened, his throat working visibly as though pushing against 2 years of silence built up like scar tissue, and when he finally spoke, his voice came out rough and unpracticed, cracking slightly around the edges from disuse. "Stay with me." 2 words. The first he had spoken aloud in 2 years, offered to no one else in the world but her. Gemma's hands flew to her mouth, tears spilling freely now, the sound of his voice landing somewhere so deep in her chest that she felt it long after the words had faded into the night air around them. She thought of Bella's office, of the humiliation that had once made her feel small enough to disappear, and understood, standing here on this balcony with the ocean stretching endlessly behind her, that she had traveled further than she ever could have imagined from that bitter morning in Boston. "Yes," she whispered, the word barely audible over the sound of the waves below. "Yes, I'll stay." Matteo slid the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled, just slightly, before pulling her into his arms, holding her the way a man holds something he never truly believed he'd get to keep. Above them, the stars scattered bright across the sky, and for the first time in 2 years, the silence that had once defined this house gave way, quietly and completely, to something far louder than words had ever been.